never saw it coming. Looking back, there were probably signs, but I was blind. Or maybe I just didn't want to see them. My name's Jonathan Reeves, and for the longest time I thought I had everything I could ever want. A thriving career, a beautiful home, and Emily, my wife of 8 years, who I believed loved me as much as I loved her. It was a Wednesday, a day like any other. I was supposed to be tied up in meetings all afternoon, but one got canceled, so I headed home early, thinking I'd surprise Emily. I parked the car in the driveway, feeling good about the day. As I stepped inside the house, I noticed how quiet it was. Usually, Emily would have music playing or be chatting away on the phone with one of her friends. But today, there was nothing. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe she had gone out. But then I heard it, the low murmur of voices coming from upstairs. My heart quickened for reasons I couldn't yet understand. I thought, maybe she had company over, maybe a friend had stopped by. But something in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I made my way up the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bedroom door, it was ajar, just enough for me to hear clearly. A man's voice, not a friendly laugh, not the casual tone of conversation, but something more intimate. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. What I saw, I'll never forget. Emily, the woman I had devoted my life to, was tangled up in bed with another man. They didn't even flinch when I walked in. She didn't scramble for the covers, he didn't try to hide. They just looked at me like I was an inconvenience. "Jonathan," Emily said, her voice as cold as ice. "I think we need to talk." Talk? After what I just walked into, talk was the last thing on my mind. I stood there, dumbfounded, trying to process what I was seeing. My world was collapsing in front of me, and she was acting like it was nothing. Who is this? I barely recognized my own voice. It sounded so hollow, so broken. I turned to the man. He looked at me with a smirk, completely unfazed. I wanted to hit him, to rip him out of my house, but I was paralyzed. Emily sat up, the sheet casually draped over her like it was just another afternoon. "This is Michael," she said, as if introducing me to some colleague. "We've been seeing each other for a while." My blood ran cold. A while? This wasn't some one-time mistake. This wasn't a bad judgment call after too much wine. This was deliberate, calculated, cruel. "How long?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. My voice cracked. I could feel the ground slipping beneath my feet. Emily exchanged a glance with Michael before she replied. "Does it really matter?" she asked, her tone so detached, as if we were discussing something trivial. It mattered to me. Of course it mattered to me. My entire life had just turned upside down, and she acted like it was a minor inconvenience. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at them, trying to piece together when my marriage had gone so wrong. The love I thought we shared had been a lie. Or maybe it was real at one point, but somewhere along the way it died and I didn't notice. I should have noticed. I should have seen it coming. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I couldn't stand to look at them anymore. Couldn't breathe. Without waiting for a response, I turned and walked out, my legs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest like it was going to explode. I made it to the car before the tears came. I hadn't cried in years, but they hit me like a tidal wave. Everything I'd built, everything I thought I knew was gone. Just like that. And the worst part was, Emily didn't even care. She hadn't tried to stop me, hadn't run after me, hadn't apologized. She had just watched me leave, emotionless. Driving away, I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from there, from the betrayal, from the lies. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had happened, but nothing made sense. How long had she been lying to me? How many times had she slept with him, knowing I was clueless, blindly believing we were still in love? The thought made me sick. I pulled over at a gas station, parked the car, and just sat there. Staring out the windshield, I felt completely empty, numb. This couldn't be happening. But it was. This was my new reality. It took a while before I could bring myself to call my best friend, Paul. When he answered, I could barely speak. I choked out the words, telling him everything. the scene I'd walked in on, the way she'd looked at me like I was nothing. He was silent for a moment. Then his voice came through the phone, steady and calm. "Come over," he said. "We'll figure this out." I drove to Paul's place in a haze, my mind spiraling in every direction. Emily's betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. As I pulled into his driveway, I realized I still hadn't processed the full weight of what had just happened. I felt like I was walking in a nightmare, one I couldn't wake up from. Paul opened the door before I even knocked. He must have seen the look on my face because he didn't say anything, just motioned for me to come inside. I dropped onto the couch, my head in my hands, and for a few moments, neither of us spoke. Finally, I broke the silence. "I don't even know how to start," I muttered, my voice thick with disbelief. "You don't have to," Paul said, sitting across from me, concern etched in his face. "I'm sorry, man. I really am." I shook my head, still trying to wrap my brain around the truth. I never thought she was capable of something like this. 8 years, Paul. 8 years we were together, and she threw it away for some guy named Michael. Who the hell is Michael? Paul didn't have an answer, and honestly, I wasn't expecting one. I guess I was just voicing the thoughts that had been rattling around my brain since I walked in on them. "She didn't even care," I continued, my voice starting to crack. "She just looked at me like I was some stranger, like I didn't matter." Paul leaned forward, his face serious. "Listen, John, you deserve better than this. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but this isn't the end for you." But it felt like the end. How could it not? Everything I thought I knew, everything I'd worked for, it all felt like a lie. Emily had been my partner, the one person I trusted more than anyone in the world. Now that trust was shattered, and I wasn't sure I could ever put the pieces back together. "Half of everything I've worked for," I murmured. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just my heart that Emily had crushed. The divorce was going to take half of everything. The house, the savings, even the retirement fund. She had already made that clear the moment I walked out the door. She wasn't going to fight for our marriage. She was going to fight for her share. "Yeah," Paul sighed. "It's brutal, man. She's going to take her cut." I let out a bitter laugh. Her cut. Like this was some business deal. She's already got another guy in my bed. But sure, take half of what I've built too. Paul's eyes narrowed. "You're going to have to fight for what's yours. Get a good lawyer." I nodded, but in the pit of my stomach, I knew I didn't have the energy for a battle. Not yet. I was still too broken, too raw. I could barely get through the day without thinking about how cold and calculated she'd been. Part of me wanted to crawl into a hole and disappear. The other part of me wanted revenge. I wanted her to feel the same pain I felt. "Do you think?" I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to say the words out loud. "Do you think she ever loved me?" Paul's face softened, and he didn't answer right away. "I think she did, at some point, but something changed. Whether it was her or both of you, I don't know. But this isn't on you, John. She made her choices. You can't carry the weight of them." That was the hardest part to swallow. I had always been the guy who could fix things. I built a career on solving problems, designing solutions, finding ways to make everything work. But I couldn't fix this. I couldn't fix us. The next few days were a blur. I moved out of the house, our house. I couldn't stand being there any longer, surrounded by memories of a life that no longer existed. Emily didn't fight me on it. She was cold, emotionless, as if she had already made peace with her decision long before I even knew what was happening. She kept the house, of course, along with half our savings. I found a small apartment across town, something temporary, just until I could figure out my next move. I didn't even bother unpacking half my stuff. What was the point? I was living in survival mode, just trying to make it through each day. Every night, I'd lie awake, replaying the betrayal in my head, over and over again. The way she had looked at me, the way she had introduced me to Michael like he was someone I should have already known. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and the more I thought, the angrier I became. I had loved her. I had given her everything, and in return, she had crushed me without a second thought. Divorce papers came a week later. She wanted to settle things quickly, Get it over with, divide everything down the middle. I stared at the papers, my hands shaking with rage. How could she be so detached? How could she move on so easily while I was falling apart? I called my lawyer, a guy Paul had recommended. He was sharp, aggressive. "We'll get you the best deal we can," he said. But I knew that no matter what deal we struck, I was still losing half of my life. And no lawyer could fix that. The day I signed the papers was the day I realized how much Emily had taken from me. Not just the money, not just the house, but my trust, my belief in love, in partnership. She had ripped it all away, leaving me hollow and bitter. I avoided mutual friends, skipped events, and stayed as far from her social circles as possible. The gossip must have spread fast, but I didn't care. Let them talk. My life as I knew it was over. At least that's what it felt like. One night, after another sleepless week, I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the empty walls, wondering how it had come to this. How had everything I worked so hard to build turned to ashes? There was no one to blame but her, and maybe, just maybe, myself, for not seeing it sooner, for not fighting harder, or maybe for fighting it all when she had clearly already moved on. Weeks turned into months, but the weight of what happened hadn't lessened. If anything, it felt heavier, as though I was being suffocated by my own thoughts. I went through the motions of my daily life, but everything felt pointless. The business I once poured my heart into barely held my interest. My work, my passion, felt like an empty shell. People started to notice too, clients, my staff, but I didn't care enough to do anything about it. Every morning I'd wake up, staring at the ceiling, wondering why I was still in this game. Why keep going when everything I thought I was working for had evaporated? Emily had moved on with her life, probably more than happy with Michael. The thought of them together in the house that I'd spent years paying for, laughing and building a new future, made me sick to my stomach. I couldn't escape it. The betrayal haunted me, lurking behind every smile I forced, every conversation I had. Friends, well-meaning as they were, tried to drag me out of it. Paul, especially, was relentless. "Come on, man, you need to get out of this funk," he'd say, practically dragging me out to bars or dinners. But I wasn't in the mood for company. The noise, the forced laughter, it all felt hollow. I couldn't connect with anyone. It was as if a part of me had been severed, and I didn't know how to put it back together. I tried dating, or at least I let Paul convince me to try. But every woman I met just reminded me of Emily in some way. Her smile, her laugh, the way she would tilt her head when she was listening. It was like my mind refused to let her go, even though I knew I had to. Every time I thought I was ready to move on, something pulled me back into the pit, and I was tired of fighting it. Nights were the worst. It was like my mind became a battlefield once the sun went down. Sleep evaded me, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I'd lie in bed, replaying every moment of our marriage, wondering where it had gone wrong. Was there a moment when I could have stopped this? Was there something I missed? Something I did or didn't do that drove her into the arms of another man? Some nights, I'd scroll through old photos, pictures from vacations, holidays, little moments captured on my phone. I didn't know why I tortured myself like that. Maybe I was looking for a clue, something that would explain how the woman in those photos could betray me so completely. But no matter how hard I looked, the answers never came. All I saw was the life we had built together, and how it had crumbled without me even realizing it. I kept asking myself the same question. How could someone who once loved me become so cold? I thought love was something deeper, something that couldn't be destroyed so easily. But I was wrong. Emily and I didn't speak much after the divorce was finalized. She had what she wanted, the house, half the money, and I was left with the rest. There were a few cold, transactional emails about the paperwork and some joint assets, but that was it. She had made her choice, and I was left to pick up the pieces of my life alone. It's funny, when you think about love and marriage, you never imagine it ending this way. You think about the fights, sure, the disagreements and challenges, but you always assume that, in the end, the love will pull you through. That the person who once stood by your side would be there to fight for you, for the relationship. But when love dies, or worse, when it was never really there to begin with, it's a brutal awakening. It's not like the movies, where someone says a few heartfelt words, and everything is fixed. No, this was reality. And the reality was that Emily didn't love me anymore. Maybe she never did. The hardest part was realizing that I had no control over it. There was no going back, no fixing what was broken. Emily had made her choice, and I had to live with the aftermath. But living with it felt like drowning. I couldn't escape the constant barrage of thoughts. What if? Why me? How did this happen? I went through the motions for months, trying to rebuild some semblance of a life, but it was like trying to build a house on quicksand. No matter what I did, I felt like I was sinking deeper. I was stuck in the past, unable to see a future beyond the wreckage of my marriage. Every time I thought I was making progress, something would trigger a memory, and I'd spiral all over again. One evening, Paul came by unannounced, as he often did. I could tell he was getting frustrated with me. Hell, I was frustrated with myself. "You're wasting your life, John," he said bluntly, sitting across from me in my messy living room. "I get that this sucks. Believe me, I do. But you can't keep living in this hole forever. You've got to start living again." "I am living," I muttered, taking a sip of my beer. "Barely." "No, you're not." Paul shot back, his voice firm. "You're just existing. There's a difference. Emily's gone, man. You need to let her go. Stop letting her control your life, even after she's out of it." Easier said than done. Letting go wasn't as simple as flipping a switch. I wanted to move on, to forget her, to find a way to be happy again. But every day felt like an uphill battle, and I was tired of fighting. "What's the point?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's the point in starting over?" I tried. I gave everything I had, and it wasn't enough. Paul sighed, rubbing his temples. "The point is that you're still here. You're still breathing. That's the point. You get to choose what happens next. Are you going to let her win? Are you going to let this destroy you? Or are you going to find a way to get back on your feet?" I didn't have an answer for him, at least not then. But something about his words stuck with me. Maybe I was letting Emily win by staying stuck in this cycle of misery. Maybe I needed to find a way to move on, even if it felt impossible. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling like I always did, I started to think about what Paul had said. I had a choice. I could either let the betrayal define me, or I could find a way to push past it. I didn't know how or when, but for the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine a life beyond the pain. For months, I lived in that limbo, a place where nothing felt right, but nothing felt wrong enough to snap me out of it. I was surviving, but barely. The days passed in a fog, each one blending into the next, marked only by the basic necessities. Going to work, eating when I remembered, and collapsing into bed at night, knowing sleep wouldn't come easily. There were moments when I felt like I was on the verge of something, an understanding, perhaps, of how to move forward. Paul's words echoed in my head more often than I cared to admit. You get to choose what happens next. He was right, of course. But knowing something and feeling capable of acting on it were two entirely different things. I'd gone through every stage of grief. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. But acceptance? That one still seemed out of reach. How could I accept that the life I'd built, the future I'd envisioned, was gone? How could I accept that Emily, the woman I'd loved with every part of me, had been capable of such cold betrayal? The bitterness of it all was like a weight around my neck, dragging me down every time I tried to surface. I could feel it in everything I did, every interaction, every passing conversation. It was like I had a sign on my forehead that read, "Broken. Don't bother." The people at work noticed, of course. I'd always prided myself on being the steady one, the guy who had it all together. Now, I could see the concern in their eyes, the careful way they tiptoed around me. No one wanted to ask outright, but the whispers were there. I could feel them, but I didn't care. I'd stopped caring about a lot of things. My focus shifted to just getting through each day, one miserable moment at a time. I had thought about leaving the city, starting fresh somewhere else. But in the end, I knew it wasn't geography that needed changing. It was me. That realization came one particularly bleak evening. I'd spent most of the day in bed, the curtains drawn, The outside world shut out. I had no desire to move, no energy to even pretend I cared. The phone buzzed on my nightstand. Paul again, no doubt, but I ignored it. He'd given me space when I needed it, but he was persistent. Always calling, always texting, always trying to pull me out of my self-imposed exile. That night, though, as I lay there in the dark, something inside me cracked. It wasn't an epiphany. It wasn't some grand moment of clarity. It was more like exhaustion, the kind that comes from being tired of your own misery. I sat up, rubbing my face, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. The truth was, I was sick of myself. I was sick of being stuck in this loop, replaying the same scenes in my head, wallowing in the same bitterness. I couldn't keep living like this. I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was any longer. I grabbed my phone and saw Paul's latest text. "Let's get a drink. You need to get out of the house, man." For the first time in months, I replied, "Okay." The bar was loud, crowded, and not exactly my scene. But Paul, bless him, knew exactly what I needed, to be pulled out of my head for a few hours, to be around other people even if I didn't want to be. He didn't push me to talk about anything. Instead, we sat in a corner booth, drinking beers and catching up on the parts of life I had ignored for the better part of a year. "So, what's the plan?" Paul asked after a while, his voice casual but knowing. He wasn't asking about my job or my living situation. He was asking about me, what I was going to do to pull myself out of this rut. I took a long sip of my drink, thinking, I don't know. I thought about getting away for a while. Maybe taking a trip, something to clear my head. Paul nodded, understanding. That might not be a bad idea. You've been stuck in your head for too long. Maybe a change of scenery will help. I've been toying with the idea for weeks now, but it never felt like the right time. There was always an excuse, a meeting at work, a project deadline, something that kept me tethered to the life I was barely living. But now, sitting in that bar, I realized there was no perfect time. There never would be. If I didn't make the decision to change something, nothing would change. "What's stopping you?" Paul asked, reading my hesitation. I shrugged, the usual excuses running through my head. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that none of them mattered. What was stopping me, really? Fear, maybe. Fear of moving on, of leaving behind the person I had been. Fear of what it would mean to let go of the past, to finally accept that my marriage was over, that Emily was gone, and that the future I had once envisioned no longer existed. But wasn't that what I needed to do? Wasn't that the whole point of moving forward? "I'll do it," I said suddenly, surprising even myself. "I'm going to take some time off work and go somewhere. Just get away for a bit." Paul smiled, raising his glass. "Now that's what I'm talking about." The decision to leave was easier than I thought. Work, thankfully, was understanding. I'd been there long enough and had built enough goodwill to take some time off without raising too many eyebrows. My boss, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Lisa, had seen the changes in me over the past year. She didn't ask too many questions when I requested the leave. She simply nodded and told me to take care of myself. With work out of the way, I started planning the trip. I didn't want to go anywhere too far, just somewhere quiet, somewhere I could think. I found a small cabin in the mountains, a few hours away from the city, and booked it for 2 weeks. As I packed my bags, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It wasn't much, but it was there, a tiny flicker in the dark. Maybe this trip would be the reset I needed. Maybe it would give me the space to finally let go of the past and start figuring out who I was beyond the wreckage of my marriage. The drive to the cabin was peaceful, the road winding through thick forests and rolling hills. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't the destination that mattered. It was the act of leaving behind the place that had held me captive for so long. When I arrived, the air was crisp and clean, the quiet almost deafening after the constant noise of the city. I stood outside the cabin, breathing it all in, feeling the weight of the past year slowly start to lift. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. The cabin was everything I needed it to be, quiet, secluded, and far enough away from everything to give me space to think. For the first few days, I did little more than sit on the porch, staring out at the mountains, letting my mind wander. There was something therapeutic about the stillness, the way the world seemed to slow down around me. It gave me the clarity I had been chasing for months but could never quite grasp. I spent my time hiking through the nearby trails, the crunch of leaves underfoot the only sound around me. Nature had a way of forcing you to confront yourself. Out there, alone in the woods, I couldn't escape my thoughts. I had to face them, sit with them, and, eventually, start making peace with them. I thought about Emily less and less as the days passed. Not because I had forgotten, but because, for the first time in a long while, I was starting to realize that what had happened wasn't entirely my fault. She had made her choice, and I had to stop punishing myself for it. One afternoon, as I was walking back from a long hike, I decided to stop by a small coffee shop I had passed a few times on my way into town. It was a quaint place, tucked away near the base of the mountain, with large windows that looked out over the forest. I figured I could use a cup of coffee before heading back to the cabin. The bell above the door chimed as I stepped inside, the warmth of the shop immediately welcoming me in from the cool autumn air. The place was cozy, with mismatched furniture and shelves lined with old books and trinkets. There were only a few people inside, most of them locals by the looks of it. I walked up to the counter and placed my order. As I waited, I glanced around the shop, my eyes landing on a woman sitting alone at a table near the window. She had dark hair that fell in waves over her shoulders and a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. Instead, she was gazing out the window, a distant look in her eyes. I don't know why she caught my attention, but something about her seemed familiar. Not in the sense that I had met her before, but in the way that I recognized the sadness in her expression. It was a look I had worn myself for so long, lost, searching for something but not knowing what. My coffee came, and I thanked the barista before walking toward a table. As I passed the woman's table, she looked up, and our eyes met. There was a brief moment of recognition, not because we knew each other, but because we both understood what it was to be in that place. Lost in your own thoughts, searching for answers. "Nice day for it," I said, nodding toward the window. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, it is." I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should say more or just leave her to her thoughts. But something made me stop. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. She blinked, clearly taken aback, but then she shrugged. "Sure. Why not?" I sat down across from her, setting my coffee on the table. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and I wondered if I had made a mistake by intruding on her solitude. But then she spoke again. "Are you from around here?" she asked, her tone curious but cautious. "No, just visiting. Needed to get away from the city for a while." She nodded, her fingers absently tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "Same here. Just needed a break from everything, I guess." I could relate to that, more than she probably realized. "I'm John," I said, offering my hand across the table. She hesitated for a split second before taking it. "Lily." We settled into a conversation that started out light, where we were from, what brought us to this little corner of the world. But as we talked, I found myself opening up in a way I hadn't expected. Maybe it was the anonymity of it all, the fact that we were two strangers who didn't owe each other anything. Or maybe it was the way she listened, genuinely interested, without judgment. I told her about the betrayal, about how my life had crumbled after Emily's infidelity. I didn't go into too much detail, but I told her enough for her to understand. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked or uncomfortable. Instead, she nodded, as if she knew exactly what that kind of pain felt like. "I'm sorry you went through that," she said softly. "No one deserves that." Her words, simple as they were, hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I had been carrying the weight of what happened, blaming myself for not seeing the signs, for not being enough. But hearing someone else say it, someone who didn't know me, who had no reason to offer empty sympathy, made me feel lighter somehow. We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing. Lily, it turned out, was also going through her own version of heartbreak. Her fiancé had called off their engagement a month before the wedding, leaving her to pick up the pieces of a life she thought they were building together. "It's funny," she said with a sad smile, "how someone can be such a huge part of your life one day, and the next, they're just gone." "Yeah," I agreed, the weight of her words settling in my chest. "It's like a piece of you is missing, and you don't know how to fill it." For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't alone. Lily understood in a way that most people couldn't. She wasn't trying to fix me or offer advice. She was just there, sharing the weight of it all, and in doing so, making it feel a little more bearable. Over the next few days, Lily and I kept running into each other at the coffee shop. Each time, we'd sit and talk, slowly peeling back the layers of our lives. There was no pretense, no pressure. It was just easy. And for the first time in months, I found myself looking forward to something again. It wasn't romantic, at least not yet. We were two people who had been hurt, who were trying to find our way back to ourselves. But in those quiet conversations, in the way she listened and the way I found myself opening up, I started to see a glimmer of hope. Maybe Paul was right. Maybe I did get to choose what happened next. And maybe, just maybe, this chance encounter with Lily was the beginning of something new. As the days passed, my conversations with Lily became the highlight of my time in the mountains. Each morning, I'd wake up with a sense of anticipation, knowing that at some point, I'd end up back at the little coffee shop, hoping to see her sitting by the window with a book and a cup of coffee. It wasn't just the conversations, though. There was something about being around her that made me feel different, lighter maybe, less burdened by the weight of everything that had happened. She wasn't trying to be a savior or fix what was broken in me, but just by being there, by sharing her own story, she made me realize that I wasn't alone in my pain. We never discussed it explicitly, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. Two people trying to heal from their pasts, finding solace in each other's company. Felt natural, easy. And for the first time since Emily's betrayal, I didn't feel like I was stuck in the past. I was starting to see a future again, though it was still blurry around the edges. One afternoon, after we'd spent hours talking in the shop, Lily suggested we take a walk. The coffee shop, as it turned out, was situated near the entrance to a small hiking trail I hadn't yet explored. So, without much thought, I agreed. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, the crisp autumn air filling our lungs, the leaves crunching beneath our feet. The trail wound through the forest, offering occasional glimpses of the mountains in the distance. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that seeps into your bones and makes you forget, even if just for a moment, about all the chaos you've been through. At one point, Lily stopped, looking out at the view from a small clearing in the trees. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, but my eyes weren't on the landscape. They were on her. She must have felt my gaze because she turned to look at me, her eyes locking with mine. There was something in the way she looked at me, something that made my heart stutter for a moment. It wasn't a grand revelation or some dramatic shift in our relationship, but in that moment, I felt something between us change. "You're not who you were when you got here, are you?" she asked, her voice gentle but probing. I thought about her question for a long moment. She was right. I wasn't the same man who had driven up to that cabin weeks ago, broken and bitter, weighed down by anger and regret. Somewhere along the way, I had started to let go of the past. Not entirely, but enough to feel lighter, more open to what the future might hold. "No," I admitted. "I'm not, and I think that's a good thing." She smiled then, a real smile this time, one that reached her eyes. "I'm glad." We continued walking, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Favorite books, movies, childhood memories. It was easy, effortless, like we had known each other for years instead of just weeks. And with each step, with each laugh, I felt myself falling deeper into something I hadn't expected. As the days stretched on, I realized that my time at the cabin was coming to an end. My leave from work was almost over, and soon, I'd have to return to the city, to the life I had left behind. Part of me dreaded it, the thought of returning to the same apartment where the ghosts of my past still lingered, but another part of me felt ready. Ready to face it, ready to start over. Lily and I had spent nearly every day together by that point, sometimes talking for hours, other times just sitting in comfortable silence. But as the end of my stay approached, I began to wonder what would happen after I left. What would happen to this connection we had built? I didn't want to leave without saying something, without acknowledging what had grown between us. But at the same time, I didn't want to force it, didn't want to ruin whatever it was we had by trying to define it too soon. On my last night in the cabin, I invited Lily to come over. I'd picked up a bottle of wine and some food from a local market, wanting to make the evening feel special, like a proper goodbye. She arrived just as the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the mountains. We ate on the porch, the conversation flowing as easily as it always did. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a mutual awareness that this was the last time we'd be sitting like this, at least for a while. As the evening wore on, and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky, I found myself unable to hold back any longer. "I don't want this to end," I said quietly, breaking the silence between us. Lily looked at me, her expression unreadable for a moment, and then she nodded. "I don't either." There was a weight to her words, a significance that made my heart race. We both knew what we were talking about. It wasn't just about the evening or our time in the mountains. It was about us, about what we had found in each other. "I know we've both been through a lot," I continued, choosing my words carefully. "And I know neither of us was looking for anything when we met. But I can't help feeling like this is something worth holding on to." Lily smiled softly, and for a moment, I worried that I had said too much, that I had misread the situation. But then she reached across the table, her hand finding mine. "I feel the same way," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't expect this, any of it. But I'm glad it happened." We sat there for a while, our hands intertwined, the silence between us filled with the weight of everything we weren't saying. There was no need for grand declarations or promises. We both knew that whatever came next, we would face it together. The next morning, I packed up my things, feeling a bittersweet mix of emotions. My time in the mountains had been healing, transformative in ways I hadn't expected. But as much as I had grown to love the peace and solitude, I knew it was time to go back to the real world. Lily came by to say goodbye before I left. We stood by my car, neither of us quite sure what to say. Finally, I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly, not wanting to let go. "Stay in touch," she said as we pulled apart, her eyes meeting mine. "I will," I promised, meaning every word. And with that, I got into the car and drove away, the mountains disappearing in the rearview mirror. But as I drove back toward the city, I didn't feel the same sense of dread I had when I first left. Instead, I felt hopeful, like maybe the future wasn't as bleak as I had once thought. Lily had shown me that it was possible to find light even in the darkest places. And as I drove, I realized that I wasn't leaving something behind. I was carrying it with me, the hope, the healing, the connection. Maybe, just maybe, I was finally ready to start over. Returning to the city was surreal. Everything looked the same. The familiar streets, the towering buildings, the hustle and bustle of daily life. But I was different. I could feel it in the way I breathed, in the way I carried myself. I was no longer weighed down by the past, by the heavy burden of betrayal and heartbreak. The mountains had stripped all that away, and in its place was a quiet sense of acceptance, maybe even hope. I pulled up to my apartment, the same one where Emily had left her mark in every corner. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I braced myself for the rush of memories that would come flooding back, the painful echoes of everything I had lost. But to my surprise, they didn't hit me as hard as I had expected. It was still there, of course, the shadows of what had been, but it no longer suffocated me. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to settle back into the space. Felt different now, as if I had reclaimed it, piece by piece. The apartment, which had once felt like a graveyard of my failed marriage, was now just a place where I lived, where I could move forward, free of the ghosts that had haunted me for so long. That evening, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine in hand, I found myself thinking about Lily. The way her smile had reached her eyes when we talked. The way her laugh had lifted the weight off my shoulders. It was strange. How someone could come into your life so unexpectedly and change everything without even trying. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen for a moment before typing out a message. Hey, made it back to the city. Missed the mountains already. Hope you're doing okay. I hesitated for a second before hitting send, wondering if I was being too forward. But almost immediately, my phone buzzed with a reply. Glad to hear you made it back safe. I missed the mountains too. And our talks. We should catch up soon. A smile tugged at the corners of my lips. I hadn't realized just how much I missed her until I read those words. And for the first time in a long while, I felt excited about the future, about the possibilities of what could be. The days passed, and I started getting back into the rhythm of my old life. Work kept me busy, and I found myself diving into projects with a new sense of focus. But even as I threw myself into my job, I couldn't shake the thoughts of Lily. We texted often, sometimes just brief messages to check in, other times long conversations that stretched late into the night. It felt effortless, like a natural extension of the connection we had built in the mountains. One weekend, I decided to take a chance and invite her to the city. I wasn't sure if she would say yes, but I knew I had to try. I wanted to see her again, to see if what we had found in the mountains could survive in the real world. To my relief, she agreed. We planned for her to visit the following weekend, and the days leading up to her arrival were filled with a mix of nervous excitement and cautious optimism. I didn't want to get my hopes up, but at the same time, I couldn't deny the feelings that had been building inside me. When the day finally arrived, I waited for her at the train station, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment I saw her stepping off the train, her dark hair blowing in the breeze, all my doubts melted away. She smiled when she saw me, and suddenly, everything felt right. "Hey," she said as she approached, her voice warm and familiar. "Hey," I replied, unable to stop the grin from spreading across my face. We spent the weekend exploring the city, walking through the parks, visiting museums, and trying out new restaurants. But more than anything, we talked. It was easy, just like it had been in the mountains, but now there was something deeper, something more certain between us. We didn't have to tiptoe around our feelings anymore. They were there out in the open, and we both knew it. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the river, I finally worked up the courage to say what had been on my mind for weeks. "I like you, Lily," I said, my voice steady but nervous. "I didn't expect any of this, but I can't ignore it. I don't know where this will go, but I'd like to find out. With you." She turned to look at me, her expression soft but serious. "I like you too, John, more than I thought I would. And I want to see where this goes, too." For a moment, we just sat there, letting the weight of our words settle between us. There was no grand declaration of love, no sweeping promises. Just two people who had found each other in the midst of their pain and who were willing to take a chance on something new. That night, we kissed for the first time. It wasn't dramatic or intense. It was soft, tentative, like the beginning of something delicate but real. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, we would face it together. Months passed, and Lily and I grew closer with each passing day. She made frequent trips to the city, and I visited her in the small town near the mountains whenever I could. It wasn't always easy. Long-distance relationships never are. But we made it work. We wanted to make it work. In many ways, Lily had become the anchor I didn't know I needed. She didn't try to fix me or erase the scars from my past. She accepted them, accepted me, for who I was. And in return, I did the same for her. We weren't perfect, and we didn't pretend to be. But we were real, and that was enough. One evening, as we sat in my apartment, sipping wine and laughing over some silly joke, I realized something. I had found happiness again. Not the fleeting, surface-level happiness that comes and goes, but the kind that settles deep in your bones, the kind that makes you feel whole. Emily's betrayal had once felt like the end of my world, like a wound that would never heal. But now, looking at Lily, I realized that it wasn't the end. It was just a chapter. A painful one, yes, but one that had led me here, to this moment, to this person who made me feel more alive than I had in years. Lily turned to me, her eyes sparkling with warmth, and I smiled. I knew, deep down, that I had finally found what I had been searching for. Not just in her, but in myself. Maybe that's what true love is. Finding someone who makes you feel like the best version of yourself. And in doing so, realizing that you were never really broken to begin with. You just needed someone to remind you of who you really were.